y'all, I'm Siri.
And I'm Jonathan.
And welcome to this year's Black Enterprise
Be Smart Hackathon.
American Airlines is excited to host the competition this year. And guys, actually me and Jonathan are both recent grads of Florida A&M University.
Hey, that's right guys, we're Rattlers. And our school competed last year. And although we didn't win the competition, we both were able to secure great tech job offers at American. And we were able to come on as new hires.
So guys, not only will you get your hands on the latest tech provided by our tech partners, but two, you can get an internship or a job. And guys, we're also gonna provide tech workshops just to help you guys get prepared to compete.
Okay, Siri. All that sounds great. But tell us about all the big prizes the winning teams are gonna get.
Okay, I was waiting for that question. So guys, we have tons of great prizes provided by us and our partners. But for the top team, for the winning team, we have 500,000 American AA Advantage miles. 500,000, $500,000.
$500,000, 500,000? Sheesh. You go a lot of places with that. I love it. And then also, Siri, let me get this straight. Is this competition completely virtual?
Guys, it's completely virtual. We are asking all 101 HBCUs across the nation to send out competitors.
Nice, I love it. And can any class participate so I can tell all my friends about this?
You can tell all your friends. I don't want to tell your freshman, your sophomore, your senior, your junior, all of them. Listen, as long as you're an undergrad enrolled in an HBCU, you're eligible to compete.
This is lit. Hey, you can secure the bag, get an internship, or even a full-time job offer from this. I love this.
Guys, and remember, it's completely virtual. You could wake up and do this. You could go outside and do this. You can do this from wherever.
So if you haven't signed up already, make sure you sign up now. And we'll see you October 9th and 10th.
See y'all.
See you soon.
Google's Vice President Global Partnerships, Bonita Stewart, has spent 3 decades leading multi-billion-dollar operations and is co-author of the book, A Blessing, Women of Color Teaming Up to Lead, Empower, and Thrive. Due for release next month, you can pre-order it now, wherever you buy books. Mori Taheripour teaches negotiation and dispute resolution at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Globally recognized for her expertise in this area, her book, Bring Yourself, How to Harness the Power of Connection to Negotiate Fearlessly, was released this year. If you haven't been feverishly taking notes already, now would be a great time to start, as these two dynamic leaders offer a masterclass on the art of negotiation in tech.
Greetings, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here at the Black Enterprise Women in Tech. Mori, it's also wonderful to partner with you on this panel. And notice I said partner because we're going to talk about negotiations today, which is probably a great place for us to start. Mori, you have such an incredible background. So let's just unpack some of the myths around negotiation. Tell us first, what makes a person a great negotiator?
Sure. First of all, let me just say I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to meet you, Bonita, and partner with you on this conversation. You two have this amazing background, so I think I have a lot to learn during this conversation. What makes someone a good negotiator? I think it's important to first say that there isn't just one type of good negotiator. Anybody can be a good negotiator. It's really about sort of the skills that you bring to the table, which are all learned. There's no such thing as only aggressive people are great negotiators or only competitive people are great negotiators. Really accommodating people can be great negotiators. It's about sort of the agility in the conversation itself to be able to pivot to different parts of the conversation, understand your audience, prepare well. So it's really skill sets that can be learned that can make just about anybody a great negotiator.
I see your book in the background. Very exciting. It came out in March. In your first chapter, you cited the chapter was What Gets in Our Way. And you had this inspiring quote. It caught me at the first page. It was by Muhammad Ali. And he said, what you're thinking is what you are becoming. So we know that there's some stereotypes that are associated, particularly from a gender perspective. Could you share a bit more, since we've talked a little bit about getting into negotiation, but let's now talk about the process and how would you recommend women prepare and what are some of the most important areas to consider during this process?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to your first question to sort of start this particular answer. In terms of sort of great negotiators, I found that all great negotiators are first and foremost curious. And I think that's really important to remember because it takes humility and curiosity to go into this process of preparation for negotiations. I think most people, if you ask them and you say, what's most important to ensure a great outcome for negotiations, most people have learned it's preparation. But what usually they think preparation means is that it's the outcome that you're focused on, right? What do you want? What are your goals? What is often left out of that conversation about preparation is really taking sort of the adequate amount of time to understand who you are, what's important to you, what are your values, how do you want people to remember you after this conversation, how do you want to treat people, and that who you are conversation is really important and often ignored because, like I said, we're always so focused on the outcome, but it's in fact that reminder, and I think this is really important for women as well because we're so often asked to not be ourselves in negotiations, right? Sort of
Yes.
don't act against type or don't smile too much because then, you look too nice. Don't frown, then you look mean or aggressive. And so we're sort of often doing this dance, and so this notion of really grounding yourself ahead of time. Who are you really? What are the things that are most important to you? Because I find that when we ignore those things and when we don't sort of honor those things, even if the outcome of a negotiations sort of by metrics alone are good, if we don't step forward in our values, in our convictions, then we often regret either how we behaved or what we left behind, right? And I think regret is really hard. It's a hard emotion. Anger you sort of get over. Regret just sort of stays with you, and I talk about it sort of like a heavy blanket. It just overcomes you. So I think my most important advice, particularly to women, is know exactly who you are. What are your values? And step into those values because our values are often, especially as women, where we get our power. And by that I mean, we often value relationships. We often value partnerships. We value things like ethics. We value in a lot of ways, I don't want to use the word fair necessarily, but we value treating people a certain way. We're often caretakers, and those things are really important to us. And that all matters. We have empathy. We have emotional intelligence. That's all a part of who we are. And so give yourself that space, give yourself that time. And then you can move on to things like understanding the outcomes you want, setting goals, and really sort of focusing on those things, which are also really important. I don't want to downplay those things because, when we don't value ourselves, we also don't ask for enough. So it's sort of one leads to the other. When we don't value ourselves, we often don't spend the time doing the research to understand what we're worth and what we can ask for. So it all starts with you, and then it moves forward to all the other parts of preparation that are important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so perhaps I can tell you, just talk a little bit about being in tech.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Bonita, because I just sort of went through this process, and like I said at the beginning of the conversation, I know a lot about negotiations, and I've sort of done my research about different industries. But the thing about the tech industry that's really fascinating to me, and I'd love for you to sort of both educate me, but also our viewers here, is that women sort of have, especially Black women, have this notion of both having to deal with the gender stereotypes in negotiations, but also racial stereotypes, right? So confounding those two things are often, in a lot of ways, really hard for women to sort of overcome stepping into negotiations. So if you can talk from the perspective you've had, a storied career in tech, if you can talk both from experience, but also how to overcome those things stepping into this conversation.
Oh, sure, Mori. First of all, for those of you that are in tech, and perhaps some of you in the audience are aspiring to be in tech, the one thing you have to understand is that when you are in tech, your risk profile is everything. It starts with if you're thinking about a role in tech. If you're in a startup, that's very different than if you join a more mature company. But regardless of whether it's a startup, a mid-growth, or even a mature company, you are in a risk-reward model. You've just placed yourself in that environment. And I've been in technology for most of my career, and it's really changed. From the large IT providers such as IBM, they really ruled the industry. But now we've actually moved to a different model. And I think it's so important for women to understand the model. It's not a salary model, it's an equity model. And so an equity model has negotiation, but it's sometimes a bit different than a salary model. And so I think it's very important to make sure that you overcome your intimidation, but you have to recognize that this is the norm for the industry. You really have to calm your own inner voice. And you talked about preparing just for a negotiation strategy. I do think that there will be in tech, there's major pivots that happen. Once you get in tech, I hope you love it because it's constantly changing, but you need to stay in the game, but you need to play the game. That's so important. And from a negotiation perspective and thinking about how you prepare yourself, there's really 3 critical junctures. One is when you join your first tech company. So you might be coming from a very traditional company. And so to be able to enter into a tech company, you need to understand that it's an equity first, salary secondary, because it's a risk reward model. So you need to make sure you understand that. The second juncture is you may decide to do a zigzag and move from one tech company to another company. But then you need to understand your value in terms of moving to another tech company, which would require a different type of negotiation. And then lastly, let's say you are in a company and that company is experiencing just high trajectory of growth. You need to make sure as a participant in the growth and based upon your contribution that you are also stepping forward and asking and making sure that you are confident enough to be able to ask for more. And I've seen this when people go into startups and I send them to the Moris of the world, to get advice, because you do need to understand and be confident in your ability, but you have to just make sure that there aren't that many of us, but do not be intimidated by that. You still need to ask for what you rightly deserve.
And I love that. I think that this notion of going to this equity model, what's really appealing to me personally is that it sort of takes you out of being in a box, right? Just that compensation box, for example. And there's a variety of ways that you can ask for different things that are beneficial to you personally, right? And align with your needs, not just today, but sort of over time. I always say, don't just negotiate your salary for today, but think about what your needs are going to be in 3 years and 5 years, because then you may be moving beyond salary. You may be moving towards like extra time off, education, so on and so forth. But what's interesting is that that model also creates a lot more questions, if you will, right? The how do I know what to ask for? Like what are the standards and what are the norms? Because when you move away from that sort of plotted standard line of just mere compensation, now there's this big world of all the things that may be available to you that you may not know, especially if you haven't been in tech. So what do you do?
Well, I think there's do's and there's don'ts. I think don't be reluctant to ask for help. I think as women of color, Black women in tech, with a low representation, we may not know, and it's okay. We may not know, but it's important to seek help. I also think you have to expand, and this is a do. Expand beyond your mentors, because we all have mentors, throughout our career, but sometimes you try to stick with the same one. That may not be the best mentor to provide advice in the technology field. So I highly recommend you actually go and get the specific, domain expertise. So when I joined Google, and that was 14 years ago, I spoke to 2 people, one, my husband. I wanted to make sure, it was a change, but I also spoke with a CTO because I wanted to understand more about what was happening in the technology space, what was the future, and just understanding a bit better more of the product portfolio. So I would say that seek individuals and think of the individuals that should be in your prep room. And, who do you want to bring in the room to actually help you validate the experience? In some case, you might be taking a risk, but maybe it's not that big of a risk, quite frankly. Careers are long. And the last thing you want to do is a major don't, is you don't want to negotiate against yourself, to convince yourself that there's something else that you should be doing. And I think today, as in tech, there's just greater transparency in the market. So Glassdoor, you can go to Glassdoor. There's Crunchbase if you want to look at certain stages of companies, if it's particularly where are they on their angel or their Series A, Series D, or are they pre-IPO? That if they're pre-IPO, there might be they're looking for your expertise. You might think about it a bit differently. And I think it's so important to know the company. If it's a public company, you should read their 10K, the proxy. If the company is public, you can get more of an understanding about the company, their compensation philosophy, as well as their long-term strategy. And then I would say find those that have been in a similar situation. That's something else that we don't necessarily do. And similar to Mori, I've also co-authored a book with Jackie Adams, and it's A Blessing, Women of Color Teaming Up to Lead, Empower, and Thrive. And one of the things that we say is we need to team up more, particularly as women of color, so that we can share our experience and some of the sage advice that we have, within the industry. And lastly, I would say, don't be afraid to ask for more, because there's always more. And you can't be afraid to ask. And also throughout your career, you are going to practice this. And so get the right people in the room and make sure that you are developing your own strategy about how you're going to pursue the opportunity.
Yeah, so what I just kind of, for a while there, what I took away was all the jargon, right? So again, I'm not in the tech industry, but there's a lot of sort of equity jargon and really sort of tech-based sort of language, right? And what occurred to me is that we talk about sort of the value of diversity a lot. I think there's value, to your point, in terms of the people that you have around you and you want to ask for help from, making sure that that team is also diverse, that each person sort of offers you a different perspective, maybe one that's more sort of assimilated with the industry itself, but somebody else who's sort of your biggest champion. So for those of us who often battle this notion of maybe imposter syndrome, not valuing ourselves enough, right? Having our own sort of cheerleading section, the people that remind you how much you're worth and what your value is. But, a lot of women feel more comfortable going to women. I think men also bring a whole different level of information to this conversation. So based on what you just said, which I loved, I think that have that team around you that can help you and support you, ask them for help, but make sure that they all contribute differently to sort of the information that you need to prepare you for these conversations. The other thing I love about what you just said, though, is this notion of women coming together and helping each other. I think that tech industry, much like a lot of other sort of male-dominated industries, it's easy to feel intimidated by this notion of, there's room for only one of us at the table. So I want to make sure I'm that one. And then we go into this place of maybe competition and less of that notion of let me turn around and help the other person behind me or the woman next to me because we've been told there's not room for more than one. I love what you just said because it very naturally says, no, the opportunities are abundant. And create that abundance for yourself, right? Don't buy this notion of sort of this mindset of scarcity, right? We create our own opportunities. And I think the innovation of the tech industry actually probably really allows for that creativity and the sort of the abundance of opportunities, if you will. So thank you for creating sort of this book that further reiterates this notion of stand in this together and make room for each other. I think that's super important.
And Mori, one of the things that you brought up is the notion of allies. Because if in fact you're going into an industry that is dominated by men, you do need to seek and find those that are willing to assist. And you would be surprised that the number of allies, we're seeing it right now in the streets. We're not out there by ourselves, for racial injustice. We're actually seeing allies come to the forefront as well. And so I do think that as you're going through a process, particularly within tech, is to also find those willing allies that are out there who are also willing to open some doors for you.
Absolutely. And I think those, like you said, those allies can be oftentimes men, and I don't want them to be left out of these conversations because, we have conversations about mentors, for example, but then there's conversations about sponsors who I think are really different. And in the case of negotiations, some people who can step before you and actually grease the wheels for you, if you will, right? Be championing you for the company and really sort of endorsing you and sponsoring you for opportunities. Because a lot of times why women don't negotiate for certain opportunities is because we don't know those opportunities even exist. We haven't heard about them, right? And so we can't go after them because we don't know. And if you have those champions and sponsors in your organizations who can make way for you and say, this person deserves to be here, or to tell you about it and help prepare you for those opportunities, then I think that's as important. What happens before the negotiations is as important as what happens during the negotiation. And I think that's crucial.
You talk about career. I think we all hear about getting a coach, and now it's, having an executive coach, for different situations, but we don't really think about having a coach when we think about negotiating. And so I do think it's important that you bring someone in. If you don't have the skill or you're new, it's important to seek that advice. And if you can seek it from someone who's in the industry, it's probably, a bit better. But I also think we have to be transparent with one another, because sometimes we've actually experienced it ourselves, but we need to share those experiences. That's the other part about, teaming up, is the fact that you're not going to go through this by yourself, or you could go through it by yourself and then you just keep it to yourself, versus actually being transparent and sharing your experience with others. Because we know, even going through the process, you talk about earlier in the conversation about regret. And so we probably all had instances, I've had my own, where it's, gosh, I should have done that differently. But I actually take that and say, let me help someone else, because they could make a similar mistake. And so that's something we have to think about. That's why the outreach is so important, is because we all haven't gone through this perfectly. And so there's an opportunity to actually help one another.
Yeah. And that transparency thing, why it's so important, is that I remember back when it was sort of taboo to talk about salaries, right? And we didn't. We wouldn't tell people what we made in a certain role. But given sort of the gender pay inequality that's out there, part of the reason why that exists and is further compounded over time is because we don't know what maybe our male counterparts are making, or what's even available to us. So if we can be transparent with one another and share that information, one, to your point, you're preparing somebody better for something that maybe you hadn't been prepared for. But it also is very illuminating, because it gives us an opportunity to know, again, what's possible. So that's one thing. The other thing about sort of this notion of maybe making mistakes, we all make them, to your point, and God knows if for every mistake I've made, I could be a pretty wealthy woman by now if there was a dollar amount attached to those things. But there's this notion of sitting in those mistakes and allowing them to create fear for you, and you not wanting to take certain chances because sort of they've created sort of scars, and you can't really let go of those things. But to be honest with you, especially in negotiations, we learn from those mistakes. And if you can take note of them, so that you don't continue to make them over and over again, then those mistakes, those scars, if you will, actually allow you to inform yourself as opposed to defining yourself by them. So I think that's really important. And I think both you and I agree on this, and I'd love for you to weigh in on this, is then recognizing our own power. and what our value is, and how important that is. Can you talk about how hard that may be, in particular, especially around negotiations, again, in a male-dominated industry where you may not see a lot of people like you? How do you avoid falling into that trap of either A, negotiating sort of against yourself, or not really understanding your worth and your value? How do you sort of deal with something like that mindset?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did for our book was also to do research. So we found that 47% of Black women are frequently the only person of their race in professional situations. And on the contrary, 73% of white women are rarely the only person of their race. And so I do think we are, it's self-imposed. And so we need to understand that we do have power. We are, as Black women, the largest, most educated cohort right now and the fastest growing. And so we have abundance of education, we have abundance of skill, and we need to own it. We need to own it and take note of it. And so I would highly recommend, even as you are working, note your contributions. Always keep a log of what you're doing, because it also builds confidence. Oh, I did this. I contributed here. I've actually provided an innovation. Having that level of documentation is almost self-affirming, so that you know your contribution, but at the same time, it builds up the confidence so that you understand that the power that you have, and the power comes through the level of contribution and the leadership within the tech company. They are always looking for those that can collaborate well, but at the same time to bring innovation, innovative thinking, new strategies, opening up new markets that perhaps they hadn't even thought about. And so you do need to make sure that you put all of your contribution, not in a box, but the fact that it's something that will continue to overflow. And that's the one thing that we have to feel more confident about. The talent is in abundance, but we have to make sure that we don't negotiate against ourselves and take the value of that down when the value is actually far exceeds what they're looking for within the industry.
Yeah, and it's so important. I often tell people, it's that notion of sort of keeping this log, if you will, and how important it is to go back and remind yourself, right? Because we can be our own worst enemies sometimes, right? And sometimes all that means is that either A, you forget, or you don't even attribute your sort of wins and successes to yourself. Oh, I was so lucky that I got this job, or oh, I'm so lucky I got promoted to this position, or I'm so grateful that I'm in this position. You can be grateful, but be grateful for who you are and what you brought to it, because it was your hard work, your blood, your sweat, your tears, all the things that you sacrificed that brought you there. So I think we have to be really careful that we don't forget those things, right? Because they are really a part of our being and who we are and all that we've accomplished. And taking credit for those things, I think, is really important. Know your value, understand it, know your story, right? It's your narrative. And I think that nobody can tell your story better than you. And I think that whole notion of storytelling is incredibly important. This log that you talk about is sort of keeping track of those things that are so central to who you are and what you need to bring forth when you're in that negotiations, when you're in those conversations, because nobody can really sort of affirm your value the way you can. And the opposite is true as well, actually.
The other thing I would say is we shouldn't shy away from wealth creation. So when we think about being in technology, you think of what has happened over the past 15 years in technology. We'll look at where we are today, where it's going. All of a sudden now we have autonomous vehicles, we have AI, big data, as well as cloud opportunities. And so we shouldn't shy away from participating in that and making sure that we understand when we say risk, there's high reward. And so that's why it's also important that you negotiate appropriately so that you can take advantage of the upside that typically comes with most, not all, but but with most technology companies. It is an industry that is considered risky,
Right.
and so, but that is the upside, and being and having an understanding of that can make the difference, quite frankly, from a wealth creation perspective.
But that doesn't always mean salary, though, right? I mean, just something else to note is that all the other, again, the pluses that you could be asking for, whether it's equity, whether it's, what have you, there's a lot of creativity here. And so, again, not putting yourself in the box is really important, right? Because usually when we talk about negotiations, we talk about salary negotiations and we only limit it to compensation. But that compensation model is also a benefits model as well. And there's so many other things that we can ask for. That either we don't think we're privy to, or we frankly haven't exercised enough sort of creativity in our own preparation. Again, going back to having the right advisors, doing your research, talking to people, so that you know sort of the wealth of opportunities that's really available to you.
Yeah, I mean, that could be simply time off. It's just something where people don't know that that's something that is actually part of the negotiation as well. Carrying over vacation, how much time do you want off, and
Right.
or how do you want to structure your day? There's probably many more perks and areas that should be considered. To your point, that's really well taken. The fact that not just honing in on one particular area, but really thinking about it more expansively across your whole life.
Yeah, and I think that just sort of, I know that we're sort of closing in on time. I think just talking about sort of some research around negotiations that it's, I think, important, particularly for women to know, is that negotiations research tells us that people who have higher aspirations, who set higher goals in terms of the outcomes that they desire, actually do better. So this goes back to sort of that original sort of quote that you had out of my book, but it's also sort of really knowing that there's power to your expectations. And so when we talk about preparation, not putting yourself in a box, asking for what you deserve, it's to know that proof is in the pudding. If you want more, you can actually get more. How is that possible? Because again, we as women have all these different attributes as negotiators that make us really powerful. We are, emotionally intelligent. We are seeking for those win-win opportunities out of these deals that the other person will even appreciate. We bring a lot to the table, our empathy, we lead with those things, our values even. And I think that's, rather than thinking that we're at a disadvantage, I think we are incredibly elegant in the way that we approach these conversations. And if we believe we're that powerful, then I think we lead with that confidence, and we can be in all these conversations.
Totally agree. And just in closing, I mean, I think there's so much talent right now that's in motion. There's just an abundance. And I do think there's an opportunity now, whether it's for women, moving into new industries such as tech, or moving into a board opportunity. But I do think it's important for us to create our own. So in our book, we call it SaaS, for those of you in tech, software as a service, but we're saying sisters as a service. Why can't we be sisters as a service? And the other thing when we did our research, we did it by across all four races, so Latinx, Black, White, and Asian. But we also went across the generations. So we looked at Gen Z as well as the millennials, Gen X, and boomers. And there are differences, but this is where the alliances should come. So the last thing I will also say is there's an opportunity for generational alliances, because just know what you don't know. And everyone should be able to lead a life without regrets, because this is something that just will be part of a muscle that you build and a skill, and you'll learn along the way. And so just think of it as a learning process.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think we regret more the opportunities that we don't at least go after, than actually going after something and being told no. Because again, we can learn from those no's, but it's oftentimes those things that I think, God, I wish I had, that I regret the most. So don't be afraid. A no just means no to this, but maybe yes to something else. And it's opening doors to other conversations and other relationships. So I've heard nothing but, power and abundance and opportunity here. And I hope that that's what people carry away with them, because that's really what I hear when I think about negotiations, is what you can make available to yourself based on these conversations.
And Mori, I've learned just in this last 30 minutes, just a lot from you that I think we're always learning, and we'll put it in practice.
Thank you so much, Bonita. I'm thinking maybe there's a career in tech for me. So,
Yes, Mori, yes,
Lovely, you're being a
absolutely,
fan.
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.